Hello, and welcome to The Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. I'm very excited for this guest. He's a close friend of mine, but one of the most impressive Canadians that I've ever met. He was the global chair of Norton Rose and is currently the Canadian chair. You correct me if I'm wrong on that, Walied. Currently the Canadian chair, but how I got to know him was he was the chair of the Erin O'Toole campaign, which he believed in before almost anyone else. I would say even before myself. So very glad to have you on the show, Walied. Here on the show, our very first question to every guest is, what do you love about Canada? But I want to give it a little bit more nuance because of our relationship and say, how has your faith impacted your love for Canada?
Well, first of all, we live in a country where you're free to practice your faith, which is a pretty remarkable thing, and it's a blessing that I think whether you care for your faith or you don't, you're not a person who has a faith, you should be very proud of. There are too many places in the world, in fact, most of the world, where if you're a Christian, it's very difficult to practice your faith. Sadly, in some parts of the Middle East, that is the case. If you are a Muslim in northwestern China now,
yeah,
right,
that is we can talk about that later, but I think that is the worst human rights catastrophe that's occurring in the world right now.
There's there's lots of sad stories around the world for sure. That one is truly one of the very difficult things to read about. But yeah, I mean, through the lens of faith, what more can a person ask for than the freedom to have one's own faith? And my dad, David, came to Canada in 1975 from Egypt. In fact, I was reflecting that in a few short years, he will, I hopefully, God willing, he has the health to see it. He'll have been here for 50 years, and a few Thanksgivings ago, I was trying to teach my kids, David, about the importance of thinking about being thankful and grateful. And so I did this corny thing that probably other parents do, which is I went around the table.
Yeah. Oh yeah. My mom loves that. It's like she lives for those moments of sharing.
Yeah. So I went around the table and I said, everybody's got to say something that they're thankful for. And we went around the table, and and that's
and for the people who don't know, that's a big table. There's a lot of kids.
Yeah, we've got 7 kids, so we went around, and little kids say goofy things, and we got to my dad, and I was very curious, and I thought he'd say that the biggest blessing in his life is my mother, his faith, and I was really curious, and I could see that he was contemplating. And he said, there is no question that the single biggest blessing and the most thankful thing for me in my entire life is coming to Canada.
Oh, yes. There it is, folks. Immigrants love this country because they know how great it is. We've talked to 4 or 5 now so far, I think, right, Zach? I don't know if you can, 4 or 5 people who have immigrated to this country, and they may love the country more than I do. And I love this country a lot.
I'm going to tell you, David, his reaction, it really surprised me because it was the first time he expressed it that way. And I asked him to unpack that, and it was all the things you'd expect. He said, he's very proud of his heritage, but he would not have had the opportunities. He did a PhD in nuclear engineering at the University of Waterloo. That would not have happened at Egypt. He worked on Canada's nuclear program. That would not have happened in Egypt. He actually developed in his faith in Canada. That may not have happened in Egypt. He had 5 boys who have all done, great things. That probably wouldn't have happened in Egypt. he looked at me and he said, if I had you in Egypt, you may be selling cigarettes by the pyramids right now to tourists.
That's wow. You know how to tell stories. There's one story, you don't have to tell it if you don't want to, that I really wanted you to share with listeners. One you shared with me, I think it was on a phone call, about the difference between faith and religion. And it was one of my favorite, I guess, Walied parables that I've ever heard. And it was about your experience with that building of that mosque. Would you mind sharing? If you don't want to, that's totally fine.
I'm trying to remember which one.
It was Muhammad couldn't be on your board of directors.
It's a very
there's a human story. This is a human story right here, folks.
Yeah,
like the most human story you can get.
I think there's a big difference between faith and religion, and religion is a set of rules, and different religions have different rules, but faith is that sort of universality of goodness, of doing the right thing, of being guided by truth. And I was telling David about a story which I thought was fascinating, and it was as a lawyer, you get community problems from time to time. And so I had the security guard in our office building who was on the board of his mosque, and it was a new mosque in Mississauga, and they were very proud of it. And he said, we need to hire a lawyer. And I just thought I don't get involved in mosque board disputes. Like, that's just, for me, the absolute
that is the worst form of politics. Absolutely. Worst. My dad's a pastor.
Yeah.
And I always said the one form of politics I never want to practice is church politics. It's just the most brutal.
It's the worst, and it's brutal, and it's unhappy. Anyhow, the way it had worked out was he and I guess a group of board members were trying to keep some of the wealthier board members off the board. In a typical sort of immigrant society, there were more folks that were not wealthy than were wealthy. And so they certainly had the votes. And so they passed a constitutional amendment. Again, the crazy stuff that happens in some of these institutions. They passed a constitutional amendment that said that in order to be eligible to be a member of the board, you had to have an Ontario secondary school, high school certificate. I mean, how insane, right? And so I invited this guy and his folks up to my office, and invited the folks from the other side, and they had a lawyer who was a lovely, lovely man, and there were literally 20 folks in my office in two different boardrooms. And I listened to it, and I had sympathy for the security guard guys, even though this amendment that they did sounded really stupid. I had sympathy for them because they, had these visions for what they wanted to do with the mosque. And, usually people who are involved in these types of organizations really, have a positive
they're those volunteers that make us a society function, right?
Yeah.
Like it's at a church, in a church context, it's the old lady who brings cookies all the time and is always cleaning up and like making sure there's coffee downstairs. Like it's those people who just give of themselves for the betterment of the community.
Yeah. And so you're right. And so, there's always like a little bit of a soft spot in your heart for that. And anyhow, I went and met with the richer guys and asked them what was up, and asked them why they even wanted to be on the board. And I remember one of the guys who was one of the big donors, and he was very sad. And he said, Walied, I've had a lot of success in my life, but I never finished my high school education. And I never let my children know that I didn't finish my high school education. And this silly constitutional amendment that these guys put me in a position where I had to come clean to my family. And it was a very embarrassing and a very difficult thing. And he cried, and it was very emotional. here I am in this high-powered law firm office. We're doing big M&A transactions. I got two factions of a mosque board in two different boardrooms with guys emotionally crying. And I went back into the other office and I listened to the guys and I said, "Why'd you guys do this?" And they said, they're not good people and we don't want them and blah, 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 blah. And, I remember it just came to me and I looked at them and I said, "Guys, number one, it's probably not legal what you've done to exclude somebody on that basis. But put that aside because I'm not sure that how much you guys care about that. What is more troubling is that you've genuinely hurt a man to the core of his pride. And the really sad part is if the Prophet Muhammad, who's the founder of this faith, actually came down from the heavens right now and said, 'I'd like to serve on the board of this mosque,' your constitution would not allow him." How insane is that? And, it was a real reminder for me that, faith is something that transcends, rules and dictates. And, had these guys sort of reflected on the impact that this was going to have on this human being, and had they reflected on, the actual true meaning behind, all the Abrahamic faiths, they wouldn't have pulled that kind of a move.
They wouldn't have done it, right? And that's the interesting thing about being human, is that if we really sit down and treat each other like humans, and this is what the Canadian story is all about. And one of our most, I didn't have to do this with you, but our 3 rules are: you have to say what you love about Canada. If you're going to criticize something, you have to have a solution. So no criticism without solution. And the third is we're here to build up our fellow Canadians, not tear them down. Because not enough of that is happening. There is not enough hype going on about how great this country is, and I've decided to become this country's biggest hype man.
Good man.
And the way I'm going to do it is by introducing Canadians to their co-characters in the Canadian story. Because who are the characters of the Canadian story? Canadians. Good so on you, David. Zach came up with this tagline, but I love it, which is Canada, one Canadian at a time.
I love it. I really love that. Good on you, Zach. I think that's great. I think, our stories across this country need to be told, and there are so many beautiful stories. And listen, I'm a huge believer in Canada, and if I have a personal purpose for my brief political involvement, and I try my best to stay focused on it. It's to preserve the excellence and beauty of this country because it is worth it.
Yes, and it's worth it. This is at least my belief of why it's worth it. And I'd love to hear yours, but it's worth it because it could potentially become an example to the world of what is possible if we can live in harmony with one another. And I've said this before, and I want to say it very clearly again, then I want your thoughts on it. Diversity is not a strength. Harmony is. Because diversity can easily cause conflict. Let's take the former Republic of Yugoslavia as an example, because it's actually a very pertinent example to the Canadian context, right?
Yeah.
In the Republic, it fell apart because they couldn't live in harmony with one another. Not because there was diversity. Diversity destroyed them.
David, I got to tell you, I haven't heard it put that way, but I think that's very wise. And I'm going to tell you what keeps me up at night in this country. We actually have a very delicate country. It's delicately stitched together. And, we, at my law firm, we have 6 offices across Canada. We're in Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. And every day I feel like our law firm is a microcosm of the Canadian story.
Yes, it would be, because you have access to people who are living the various parts of it at all times.
And, I just chairing our firm's board with representatives from all those offices, it's delicate. It is delicate. It's the first time, as an Ontario-born Canadian, it's the first time that I've actually really come to appreciate that it's delicate to string together those 6 offices, because there are unique cultural dynamics, and that's a microcosm of our country. And I'll give you the unique cultural dynamics just for fun, David.
Yeah, well, tell stories or what this is all about.
I'll tell you, David. For me, other than this year, I try to go every year to every one of our Christmas parties, and the Calgary Christmas party is held with spouses on a Saturday night, and it's set and it ends around 8:30. Okay. Our Vancouver party is, in a big restaurant with people just sitting down and having a dinner. Our Toronto Christmas party, it ends at 9:00. It starts at like 6. There is a bar, but there's certainly no dance floor. And there, you sort of walk around and talk to people and leave.
Very cocktail-esque, right?
Very, Montreal. God bless them.
Oh, what a place.
So I remember the first year I went, I was booked to come back on like the 9:30 flight, and thought I was going to be a good old Toronto boy and, say goodbye to everybody around 8:30. And the managing partner says to me, "You don't understand. The way this works is folks have started sort of the party at around 2:00 in the afternoon. The dinner doesn't start until about 8:30, 9:00. There is a huge dance floor, and there are no spouses."
Oh, wow.
Right. And I remember sort of sitting there, and of course I canceled my flight and I ended up staying. And I, because one of the things you learn about creating the harmony that you're talking about in this country is you have to be respectful. You have to be respectful. Like, it would have been the height of disrespect to be the boy from Ontario who leaves at around 9:30. So I stayed. But as I was watching this, I just thought, this would be so far outside of what is acceptable in Calgary for this type of professional environment, and so far of what would be acceptable in Toronto. But this is normal here. I'll give you another example, which is one that is difficult for some people to understand. But I don't speak French fluently. But I've learned that, like, if I don't make a really strong, hard effort to include, French paragraphs in, any talk that I'm doing nationally at the firm, and certainly a French translation of any formal email that goes out, it's not that it's offensive, actually. It's hurtful to good people.
Makes them feel ignored, unseen, and unappreciated.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, it really came to mind that this year we did our Christmas party virtually. And I worked with one of our folks from our marketing department in Quebec, and worked on a couple of French paragraphs. And I really sort of tried hard to put them in. I'll never forget, after it was done, I don't know this woman very well. She just sends me this note. She said, "I just want you to know how much I appreciate personally that you cared to speak in French."
And I want to work off that point.
We forget that.
I want to work off that point. Not that I disagree with you. It is about respect, but it's actually about caring.
Yes.
It's about loving the other person, right? And saying, you know what, this matters to you, so it's going to matter to me, right? Only because it matters to you. That's it. That's the only reason.
David, let me extend that. When I was a kid growing up in Mississauga, you sort of hear some of our right-wing friends talk about the war on Christmas and blah, 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 blah. Here's the reality. It's sort of true. And I'm going to tell you, when I was a kid in Mississauga, there was such an effort I remember I was in grade 2, and there was me and this Jewish kid in the class, and we were the only ones that didn't celebrate Christmas. And there was a real attempt at sort of like this really sort of respectful thing of like, okay, we're not putting up a Christmas tree, we're not doing this, da, 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 da. And as I got older, I remember during Ramadan having people who don't celebrate Ramadan saying to me, "Happy Ramadan, I hope your fast is going well." And I remember the happiness that gave me. And I started saying to folks, hey, why not shout from the rooftops, Merry Christmas?
Because we love the people who celebrate it.
Yes. And you want to know something? I love when people say to me, Happy Ramadan, and I hope your fast is going well, or Eid Mubarak. I love it. Why wouldn't I want that same love and happiness for somebody who's celebrating Christmas?
Like, that's the perspective. Let's not make loving other people about ourselves. Let's make it about them.
And so I make a point. I make a very strong point. I made a point of making sure that we have a Christmas tree in our firm lounge. Or a firm foyer. We hadn't had one for many years, and I make a point in my emails to say Merry Christmas, not Happy Holidays.
I love this point, and I want to go even further on it, because this is how we heal.
Yeah,
this is how we heal. When people like you can come, and people like you who have been viciously attacked for your faith by hateful people can say, other people's hate will not make me hate.
Oh, of course not. One of the challenges, I think, in general sort of religious upbringing, and it's been my observations with my friends who are Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, is that as young people, we are taught so much about these sort of stories and rules, but we're not focused, and our upbringing hasn't been focused on the true meaning and beauty of faith. And I'll tell you, in my own journey and in my own faith, in my own journey, I was just like any of these other young people who just was, in the Islamic faith, you have to memorize certain passages.
Oh, and it's the same in the Christian faith.
Really?
My parents were hammering the Bible into me from like before I could read.
well, here's the thing: the Quran is in Arabic, and so I didn't even understand it.
You didn't even know what you were memorizing.
I didn't even know what I was memorizing, and so I started a journey in my early 30s. And I'm on the third round now, where I've been reading the Quran in English.
I love that.
Yeah, I've been reading it in English, and I've been trying to find every translation I can possibly find, because whenever something is translated, you lose meaning. Words have different ways, and authors bring in their own biases. And so I've really been trying hard. And probably about 6 years ago, I came across these 3 beautiful passages, and it was one of the real moving moments for me, because I was like, I can't believe that nobody taught me this, and I'm in my 30s.
Right.
And the passages are that repel evil with what is better, and thereby the person with whom you have a dispute shall become your most loyal friend. The second paragraph says that it is very hard to refute or to repel evil with what's better, and if you and what you need is an open heart and lots of patience. And then the third paragraph says it's really hard to have a lot of patience and an open heart with somebody who does that. And if you feel like you are losing your patience, Ask God to help you.
Oh,
Have
yes.
patience.
Yes.
And I remember reading those 3 paragraphs, and I'm not criticizing any of our upbringings because we all have,
imperfect people raised us, so we can't judge our parents for being imperfect.
No,
we can only try to build off the legacy they've given us, right?
And I think they genuinely were trying in the way that they felt right. And I tell you, in the immigrant experience, it's like, man, if I don't get these kids to memorize these 30 passages, I will have failed as a parent. But it's like we didn't understand any word. There was no point.
Right.
And I remember reading those 3, and I wish I could show them to you because I'm looking at them right now. Actually, I actually had a calligrapher write the 3 paragraphs, and I put them on my wall where I work. Because
just on a side note, that is beautiful for 2 reasons. The first is that this is something that I'm starting, is I want people who love beauty to pay artists to make it for them.
Oh, for sure.
We should be doing this way more. We shouldn't be relying on government to give our artists a living. We should be treating Canadian artists like the treasure they are. And if they don't want to make the art that we are at, so I've commissioned a song by my cousin about my grandpa's farm.
That's
because
awesome.
I wanted something beautiful to build as a monument to my grandfather's, perseverance, love of the land, that kind of stuff. It's a very personal family song. I love that you are going to artists and saying, this is very meaningful to me. I'm not a calligrapher. I can't write this out, but you are. I have money to give you to do that. That is capitalism at its finest.
Oh yeah. And I'll tell you, anyhow, so I agree with you, and I think I probably haven't appreciated the arts as much until recently, and it's become something that's important to me in my life. Anyhow, but David, like one of the things I thought to myself is, how is it possible that I'm learning about that in my 30s? Like I should have learned like this. That should have been like sort of 1 or 1A in my faith-based education, right? Like not something I have to like pick up on my own much later. And I think that if people, that principle, by the way, is of course, and I've gone on to read a lot about those principles are in every one of the Abrahamic faiths and beyond. And
well, truth is truth, however it's packaged, right? And I think one of the most fundamental truths that I've only learned very recently is if you can attach yourself to a love force, whatever you believe that is, but if you can find a source of validation and love outside of other people,
yeah,
and if you can then channel that source, whatever you call it, I call mine Jesus, you call yours Allah.
Yeah.
One of us is right or we're both right. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't matter, because if you can find that, you will become secure. And as soon as you have that internal security, your power is endless. And not to promote yourself, but to love others.
For sure. You're absolutely right, David. And look, we all have our journeys, and we take our journeys through through different ways, and yeah, it's been a fun journey for me.
So I have a question for you about that journey. So obviously there are people, and I just want for the listeners, this is for listeners, this isn't for you, but there are people who've attacked you, but more importantly, there are people in this country who I think are very hurting and misinformed, who have decided to blame others for their problems, right? To essentially say, well, the real problem here is all the Muslims. This is, that would be a phrase that you would hear from some people.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not productive thinking, and we kind of write those people off as, just degenerates or whatever, racist, bigots. But the truth of the matter is that there's actually a deeper problem here, which is that we're not communicating with one another. And that comes back to my story, right? Where I was being radicalized against Islam. I grew up as a very strong evangelical Christian, and then watching what happened in 9/11, there was a lot of propaganda that was turning people. There were political parties that were using people's faith for their own gains. This is something that happens frequently. And so I was feeling myself becoming anti a certain religion, seeing it as the enemy. And my girlfriend at the time was the one that kind of snapped me out of it, because she had a friend who is, his name's Rami. He's a devout Muslim. Yeah. And he's also one of the most caring and thoughtful people I've ever met. And she said, you need to start to go for breakfast with him every week and talk to him about his faith. And what you'll discover is that he's no different than you. In fact, he's probably better than you, which is true. He was, because he was practicing his faith much more clearly than I was. And all it took for me to end that radicalization was to open myself up to another person, not an idea, a person. Because as the old saying goes, it's really hard to hate someone you know.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And I'll tell you two things. Number one, that goes both ways. I grew up with a lot of, my friends in the Muslim community, who really just, don't want to get to know anybody outside of their faith, or outside of their sort of their thinking comfort zone. And that's really dangerous. And certainly with my kids, I want them to embrace other people. They need to understand that the world is not a monolith. In fact, one of the things that I think that my dad did that I think was really cool is we went to an Islamic school sort of growing up, but my dad insisted, and I've done the same with my kids, insisted that it ends at grade 8. And the reason for that is you've got to get to know other people, and you've got to figure out what's going on, and you've got to speak to folks. The second thing I'd say to you is, I never write off people, and I've been sometimes my wife thinks I'm a little crazy, but I never write off people. I never, and I think it's an important principle, and everybody's got their story, everybody's got their history, and I certainly have so much more to learn from so many people, and everybody has their biases, and everybody has their, and you know what? Maybe for somebody, 9/11 was actually like the straw that broke the camel's back after there hasn't been any Merry Christmas or a Christmas tree for 7 or 8 years before that too. Right. And maybe that dialogue needs to happen. So,
well, I think you basically solved. I think you've solved that problem, right? You've told people, hey, look, it isn't about you. It's about them. Sorry, it's not about you. It's not about how you feel. It's about the fact that we're Canadian. This is how we live in harmony with one another, by loving one another. Yes. And how do you love one another? It's very simple. It's not about you.
No, it's but that's, if you're, David, hopefully you'll soon be in a marriage. I'll tell you, one of the keys to a successful marriage is to remember that you have a partner, and that you are imperfect, and that, that you got to learn from each other. And sometimes you have to set an example, and sometimes you have to set an example for 5 years. And sometimes things don't ever change, and sometimes things are weird, and sometimes things aren't.
Love can't be outcome independent. When you agree, it has to be a process.
100%. But I got to tell you, like, with all of that said, I'm such a believer in this country, right? Like, we have so much to be excited about. And, Canadians are, when I think of my dad, God, how would he have, I mean, the ACL was, where he sort of worked. It was this strange conglomerate of folks where there was a large contingent of English folks from Britain. And there was a large contingent of folks from India and a large contingent of folks from Egypt. And the reason for that was actually quite simple. Those were in Britain, there was a team of folks that had nuclear energy experience. And in India and Egypt, they were actually Soviet trained engineers. they literally were. And Canada,
right.
And Canada opened up.
We just took them. We took everybody.
We took them. We took their best engineers. Like literally.
This is the Canadian story. We take the world's best.
They did. They took the world's best and they brought them here to Canada. And, I remember growing up and, meeting a man with a turban for the very first time and thinking to myself, like, yeah, that would not be an experience my dad would have had in Egypt.
No.
I remember, I'll tell you this story, David. I remember Saskatchewan. My dad had been in Canada for about 12 years, just gotten used to Toronto cold. And Saskatchewan decided it was going to build a nuclear reactor.
It's not even cold in Toronto.
Yeah. So Saskatchewan decided they were going to build a nuclear reactor. And my mother, God bless her, she just said, look, Saskatchewan's too cold. We'll come in the summer. You
go there by yourself.
But you're going to go there by yourself. We will come for 4 months in the summer, but we are not going there in the winter. So my poor dad went out there. And I'll never forget this. He met this young man, Shane. I don't even know what Shane's last name is, but he became my dad's son. And Shane was a junior engineer in Saskatchewan who took full care of my poor dad and took him to a rodeo and took him and taught him how to plug in a car and took him to pancake houses and took him to a karaoke thing. And I remember my dad would say, with his accent, he'd say, Shane is a beautiful boy. I love Shane.
Oh, yes.
I love Shane. And Shane, is a very successful engineer today. And to this day, he shows my dad such great respect and calls him, and my dad, speaks to him. And, maybe Shane wouldn't have had that experience, right?
That is the Canadian story, folks. Like, that is it right there. It's people loving each other. Despite having such vastly cultural vast, a man born in Egypt and then one born basically in the tundra. And they befriend one another, right?
Yep.
So we don't have much more time. So I just want to go back to one point that I think is incredibly important, at least to me for this episode. And I know it's important to you, is the distinction between faith and religion and how that could save Canada. Because right now, and so now I'm going to go a little bit broader on a sociological level. Religion is not just a belief in God. And there are religions that don't have a God. Well, all religions have a God, but they don't call it a God.
Yeah.
And one of those, I'll take Trump, for example. A lot of people they even call him the God Emperor, right? And everyone's like, oh, they're joking. They're not really joking. They worship him. And now David Foster Wallace wrote a very good piece at once where he said, there are no atheists in adult life. You have to worship something. And everyone does, whether that's money or power or prestige or a god or whatever you worship. You do worship something, because if you didn't, then you wouldn't live. Tolstoy wrote, where there is life, there is faith. In order to continue life while confronting our own mortality, we must have faith in something. And that doesn't have to be faith in life after death, but you can't deal with the existential pain of mortality without faith. So all of that said, religion is evil. Trying to impose your faith on another person is a sign, in my opinion, of a disconnection from reality. Because the truth is, You can't. You can't force someone to believe anything. You can force them to act in a certain way. You can force them to adhere to a certain set of rules. But at the end of the day, you are never actually going to be able to make them do what is really actually important to faith, which is believe. And so any attempt to do so is, in my mind, the evil of tyranny. Now, there are a lot of theologians that are going to be mad at me for saying that. But I'm okay with that, because what I'm trying to build in Canada is harmony, and what they're trying to build is adherence.
Fascinating.
So I just like your thoughts on that.
So, it very wisely put. I wouldn't go as far as to say religion is evil. I think that there are folks who use religion as a tool for evil. There's no question about that. And they're all over the place, and they disgust me. And I think there's a special place in the dark world for folks who do that.
I believe that too, yes. Well, right? and part of the dark world is their own souls.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it corrupts them. To the use. I mean, they say power corrupts. Right.
Yeah.
But I disagree with that statement. I think the attempt to control others corrupts.
I think that, part of living when you actually read through history of the most beautiful stories of people taking on the Christian faith or the Muslim faith or the Jewish faith or Hinduism or Buddhism or otherwise, it's actually through the demonstration that the faith is a source of beauty and societal improvement.
Well, this is from a Christian perspective, and that's the one I understand the best because it was the one I was raised in. But there is this idea that you will be born again, right? That the truth will set you free. And I think that a lot of my Muslim friends that I've talked to say the same thing. They say that when they really embraced their faith, their soul was set free.
The challenge is in sort of one's fight against sort of one's ego in life and that sort of thing. It's actually really hard to embrace a faith and to try to continue in your day being a good person. And it's so easy to just say, I'm a good person. I actually think it's the height of arrogance to actually think that you are there. And, one of the things that one of my friends taught me, David, that I've been trying is actually to list out on a piece of paper, what are the elements of excellence that you want to adhere to in your life. So I'll tell you one of them for me, that's a big personal challenge. I have 3 teenagers.
Oh.
One of my biggest personal challenges is patience, which is a critical element of any faith. And it's the critical element of just being a decent human being. And one of the things I've been doing is literally writing down and scoring myself every single day.
Oh, I love that.
But David, I'll tell you, I fail
more than you succeed. But okay, so this is just an opinion I have on failure. Failure is not the enemy either. Mm-hmm. Failure is the tool. Failure is the fuel for success, because failure, properly used, teaches you lessons.
Absolutely. And in all faiths, every faith that I've ever come across, failure, which is, falling into sin,
falling short of God's standard is actually something that is not only acknowledged, but it is accepted as part of all of our journeys. Exactly. Okay, so sorry, I know we only have 5 more minutes, but I have one last point that I want to make before we go, and that is actually something that I thought about. So I was thinking about this conversation. I was thinking about our conversations that we've had, and what struck me, and I want your opinion on this, just this little thought that I had, was really the difference between faith and religion is humility. A person of faith is humble, and really, and this is, I have, for those listening, the people who know me, I have struggled all my life with pride and ego, and I have a big one. And it is
you're not the only one, by the way. We all have that issue, and
it is a war. And I guess the difference between me and others is that I often express that ego more loudly and publicly than I should. So what the realization I had was I've struggled in my faith, in belief, and then the science behind it and all that. And the conclusion I've come to is that the reason that faith is important has really nothing to do with anything you do. It has to do with your perspective. And if your perspective is coming to any given topic with a sense of humility versus a sense of pride, doesn't matter what the situation is, you're going to have struggles. Struggles are coming, right? As Jordan Peterson says, suffering is inevitable. But if you approach suffering with humility, you're never going to feel like a victim.
Yeah. Listen, I think that's very well said, David. And I think that, look, the struggle against one's ego, I think it was Ronald Reagan, actually. I remember this quote from a couple of decades ago, reading it, that there's no heights to which a man can go if he can conquer his ego.
Well, yeah, and this new movement towards Stoicism, which I really enjoyed because I love Marcus Aurelius and I love meditations. This new movement, Ryan Holiday wrote a book called "Ego is the Enemy."
It is, and it's the enemy in a marriage. It's an enemy in a relationship with one's children, with one's work colleagues. I had an issue recently with the board of my firm, and I really, as the chair, I was very upset with the position that was being taken by a majority of the board. And I talked to somebody who is at another business that I care for, and I explained it to him, and he said, "Why don't you just say thank you for that position and let's work together and let's study it? Why are you letting your ego get in the way of advancement of something which may be positive for your firm?" And it was sort of this aha moment where I was like, because I didn't conquer my ego, and that was a very good reminder and lesson.
Well, and there's this great First Nations proverb that I adhere to, or try to adhere to. I want to be clear with everyone. I never want to be a hypocrite. So I've not conquered my ego. And this war is going to be an eternal struggle, right? This is
probably until the day we die, David. We'll be with Canes doing this podcast in 3D, and Zach will be,
Zach will be like, those guys, they still haven't quite got the ego done yet.
They still think they're philosopher kings.
But yeah, so the proverb goes like this, and it's just the wisdom of the land, the wisdom of our First Nations people that I appreciate so much. And it goes like this: all of us have two wolves fighting within us. One of them is pride and ego and greed and selfishness. And the other is all of the positive qualities that we've talked about with faith. And these two wolves are constantly fighting within you. And so the elder who was sharing the story got asked a question by one of the young apprentices. It said, "Which one wins?" And the response of the elder was, "The one you feed." I just think there's tons of wisdom there. There's tons of wisdom there.
That is a lot. There's a lot of wisdom there. This has been fun, David.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I'd like to, at some point, maybe months from now, have you back on to talk about law in Canada, and because there's nothing probably that you're more of an expert on. So, yeah, thank you so much for coming. You've had a huge impact on my life. I know you've had a huge impact on a lot of people's lives. Part of what I wanted to do here too is show those nasty online trolls what a beautiful soul you are. And if they choose not to see it, then fuck them.
Thanks a lot, David. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's the CAD story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.